In this long-form podcast, I want to take you through an uncomfortable road, the road of discipline, love, truth, and maturity. This is not a table of contents for the road less traveled. It is one continuous journey. We begin with the claim that life is difficult, then move into avoidance, blame, procrastination, love, dependency, belief, grace, and finally the paradox that even the person who points to the road may still be struggling to walk it. The brutal truth: life is suffering, and that's good news. At the beginning of the book, author Scott Peck does not comfort us with sweet words like, "Everything will be okay." On the contrary, Dr. Peck immediately poured cold water on the readers with a strong assertion: this life is inherently very difficult. It sounds extremely negative, right? But the beauty lies in the fact that he himself affirmed that this is one of the greatest truths of humanity. To make it easier for you to imagine, I want to tell you a metaphorical story about a tree. Imagine a tree grown in a perfect greenhouse. The temperature is always stable. There is not a single strong wind. Water and nutrients are supplied to the root. How do you think that tree will grow? In fact, it will have very shallow roots and extremely soft wood fibers. Just once the greenhouse has a problem or there is a small impact, that tree will fall immediately. But a tree living in the midst of harsh nature is different. It is the sandstorms, gusts of wind, and harsh weather that force it to root deeply into the ground to hold on. It is the problems of the weather that have tempered the strength of the wood grain. We humans are the same. Author Peck commented that problems and difficulties are the greatest catalysts for us to grow. However, the ironic truth is that most of us spend most of our time complaining. We whine about problems, about work burdens, about family conflicts as if life should have been easy. There is an extremely valuable insight in the book that I want you to remember. Happiness does not come from avoiding difficulties, but from accepting and overcoming them. When you truly understand and accept that life is difficult, that difficult suddenly no longer makes you miserable. Why? Because then you no longer waste energy being upset about, why did it happen to me, but you start using that energy to solve the problem. Look at real life. Do you find yourself using soul painkillers? For example, instead of having a difficult conversation with our lover to resolve the conflict, we choose to surf TikTok for 3 hours to forget our sadness. Or instead of starting to work on a stuck project, we procrastinate by going out drinking. Scott Peck calls this the avoidance of legitimate pain. He borrowed the words of psychologist Carl Jung to assert something that deeply shocked him. Neurotic disease is always a substitute for legitimate pain. That is, when you avoid the short-term suffering of facing the problem, you are setting yourself up for a kind of long-term sickness. The price of avoiding is that you will get stuck. Your soul will stop developing and you will gradually become a child in an adult's body, also known as Peter Pan syndrome. So, next time you're in trouble, instead of asking, why me? Try changing your perspective. This is a test to make me stronger. Facing a problem not only helps you solve it, but it also teaches you courage and intelligence that no school can teach. Hold on to this question. Right now, is there any problem in your life that you are intentionally ignoring because you are afraid of pain? That question matters because accepting that life is difficult is only the first door. To mature, we have to look directly at the ways we avoid legitimate pain. From here, the story moves one layer deeper. I want to ask you an even heavier question. Do you believe that most of us are living in a mental state to some degree just because we are too afraid of facing pain? Sounds extreme, right? Let me tell you a true story that Dr. Scott Peck met in his therapy room. It is the story of a young soldier's wife in Okinawa. She intentionally committed suicide with a razor and was fortunately saved. When Dr. Peck asked why, she complained that she couldn't stand living there because she had no friends and wanted to go home immediately. The doctor advised her to try to make friends, but she said the area was full of locals who didn't speak English. The doctor told her to drive to the American area. She told her husband to drive to work. The doctor again suggested that she take her husband to work and then take the car to go out. She replied, "I only know how to drive an automatic car, and my husband's car is a manual car." Do you see anything here? She would rather die than have to learn how to drive a manual car to solve her problem. She believes that she is not wrong, just wrong that no one bought her an automatic car. This is a prime example of what Scott Peck calls the avoidance disease. The author asserts that the tendency to avoid challenges and the pain that comes with them is the root of all human mental illness. To be honest with you, when I read this paragraph, I had to stop and ask myself for a long time. We often think of mentally ill people as people with strange behavior, but according to Peck, psychopath is sometimes simply our refusal to endure legitimate pain. Instead of facing the problem directly, we choose to bypass it, ignore it, or worse, use drugs, social networks, or temporary pleasures to numb that painful feeling. In the psychology world, there is a very famous quote by Carl Jung that Scott Peck quoted: "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate pain." Do you understand what legitimate pain is? It's the pain when you have to admit you're wrong, the pain when you have to make an effort to learn a new skill, or the pain when you have to end a relationship that is no longer healthy. When you avoid these pains, you are never free from suffering. You are just exchanging legitimate pain for something called sick pain, a persistent pain that keeps you stuck, stops growing, and your soul gradually wears out over time. Let's look at everyday life. This is a very real example. There are people who know they have a problem with alcohol, but instead of admitting that they are addicted to quitting, they lie to themselves saying, "I just drink a few drinks after a tiring day of work." Or like social media addiction, we justify ourselves to update information, but in reality we are running away from the feeling of emptiness or pressure of the work right in front of us. Every time we avoid it like that, the problem doesn't go away, it only grows bigger, while we ourselves become weaker and sink deeper into the maze of lies. Author Peck compares our perception of reality to a map to traverse the terrain of life. If we persist in holding on to an outdated or misleading map simply because we do not want to face the painful truth, we will certainly lose our way. Avoidance leads us to build unreasonable illusions to take refuge in, and the price we pay is true peace of mind. So, I want to send you a question to contemplate. Have you ever realized that you are deliberately choosing a lifestyle full of anxiety and fatigue, morbid pain, just so you don't have to face a certain painful truth, legitimate pain, in your life? Remember, avoiding difficulties also means you are avoiding your own growth. The path to true happiness is not around pain, but through it. At this point, a sharper question appears. Why is it so hard for us to admit our mistakes? Why do we prefer the role of victim over the burden of agency? The answer lives inside a very comfortable trap, the feeling that none of this is our fault. From avoidance, we step into the victim trap. Have you ever heard someone or yourself say things like, "I can't succeed because this company is too toxic. I'm grumpy because my parents were too strict in the past," or "My life is miserable because I don't have the time"? The feeling of being a victim is really addictive because then we have a passport, so we don't have to do anything. It's not my fault. Tranquilizer or chronic poison. Let me tell you about a case that Dr. Scott Peck encountered. There is a young man who, even though he is nearly 30 years old, still depends entirely on his parents. When asked why he didn't move out to live on his own, he had an extremely convincing reason. Inflation was high, the job market was too harsh, and his old boss bullied him and made him lose confidence. It sounds like he's a victim of the economy, right? But Dr. Peck pointed out a more heartbreaking truth. While he was busy blaming the system and luck, he completely gave up his right to self-determination. He chooses to stay in his comfort zone full of resentment instead of accepting the pain of having to make an effort, being rejected when looking for a job, or having to save money to go out on his own. Here's the key insight from the book. You can't solve a problem by saying, "It's not my problem." Peck asserts that, even though you are not the one who caused the problem, once that problem is present in your life, it is your responsibility to solve it. Many people often confuse between fault and responsibility. For example, a drunk car crashes into your fence. It was completely the driver's fault. But fixing the fence to make your home safe is your responsibility. You can sit there screaming and cursing the driver for the rest of your life, but the fence will never heal itself, and the person who will suffer in the end is still you. When you throw away your responsibility, you also throw away your right to grow up and turn yourself into a heavyweight for society. Two extremes of mental illness: blame or embrace. In the book, Dr. Peck also shares a very interesting and somewhat controversial perspective on how we accept responsibility. He divided people into two groups. Blame group, personality disorder. These are people who always see fault in the outside world. They feel they are always right and that all problems are due to other people. They make those around them suffer because of their irresponsibility. Holding on group, nervous disorder. This group is the opposite, taking everything into their own hands. I should have. I shouldn't have. They torment themselves with excessive self-esteem and guilt. The surprising truth is that most of us are a little bit of both. True maturity is when you are alert enough to know what you need to take responsibility for and what you must refuse to accept. Try looking at everyday reality. Why do you choose to stay in a relationship that you constantly call toxic? If you say because she refuses to change, congratulations, you just fell into the victim trap. The right question is, why do I choose to stay? What am I afraid of if I leave here? When you change the subject from they to I, that's when you begin to take back the steering wheel of your life. Living by blaming is easy, but it makes you weak and stand still. Living responsibly is painful, but it gets you far. Be really honest with yourself. Is there anything in your life right now that you are blaming on circumstances to avoid making a decision? Taking responsibility is the first step toward freedom. But to keep that freedom, we need a very practical discipline. Choosing the difficult thing first. Once we stop blaming, discipline enters everyday life. Have you ever wondered why there are extremely smart people who have excellent degrees, but their careers still stagnant, while seemingly normal people go very far and live extremely leisurely lives? The answer sometimes lies not in IQ, but in the way they eat a piece of cake. The art of eating frogs. Why do successful people like to suffer first? Let me tell you a classic story from Dr. Scott Peck's clinic. He once treated a 30-year-old financial professional who was extremely talented but had serious trouble with procrastination. After many conversations, Dr. Peck discovered a very small detail that was the key to decoding her entire life. When eating a piece of cake, she always had the habit of eating all the sweet, greasy cream on top first, then lazily eating the dry cake underneath. It sounds like it has nothing to do with financial work, right? But in fact, that is an exact copy of the way she lives. She always grabs the easy, fun things first to enjoy the feeling of instant satisfaction, and then at the end of the day, when her energy is depleted, she has to face in horror the mountain of difficult tasks remaining. As a result, she always lives in anxiety, guilt, and her work is stagnant. The most valuable insight that Scott Peck draws from here is the concept, delaying desire, delaying gratification. He defines it as the process of planning for the hardships and joys of life in such a way that we choose to face the pain first so that we can enjoy the joy more fully later. Many of us are living the ice cream first lifestyle. We choose to surf social networks for 2 hours as soon as we sit at our desk because it brings instant dopamine. But you see, while surfing the web, the frog, the most difficult task, is still there. It haunts our minds, making the joy of surfing the web no longer complete because the feeling of guilt keeps clinging. Scott Peck affirms, discipline is not a constraint, but a path to freedom. And the way to practice this discipline is the eat the frog principle. Handle the hardest, most distasteful tasks, things that make you want to run away the most, at the beginning of the working day. Once you've dealt with that legitimate pain, the rest of your day will be a series of sweet rewards. You have the right to rest, go out, or work easily without any lingering feelings about unfinished responsibilities. Let's look at real life. The secret of maturity is actually very simple. Mature people are people who know how to say no to temporary desires, to say yes to long-term goals. For example, instead of buying a genuine phone in installments right now to satisfy their ego, a disciplined person will choose to save and use the old phone for a while longer to have capital to invest in the future. They choose suffering first to be happy later in a sustainable way. We often mistakenly think that people with iron discipline are people with extraordinary will. In fact, they are simply people who are good at ordering pain and pleasure. They know that if they run away from difficulties now, they will pay the price with a much greater pain in the future, stagnation and failure. So, I want to send you a question to contemplate before ending this section. Will your breakfast tomorrow be a layer of sweet cream but leave an anxious aftertaste all day long, or a frog that is difficult to swallow but will bring you true freedom for the remaining 23 hours? Accepting eating frogs and taking responsibility is a major step toward maturity. But what if we are disciplined and responsible while the map of reality in our mind is pointing in the wrong direction? From here, the story is not only about endurance. It is about seeing life as it actually is. Once we have discipline and the courage to take responsibility, we will talk about something equally important: your navigation device. Have you ever been in a funny situation when traveling, insisting on trusting Google Maps and then eventually being led straight into a dead end or a cliff? Our lives are exactly the same. Many of us are trying to find happiness and success with an inner GPS that is decades out of date. Reality map. Are you living by outdated GPS? Let me tell you a story that Dr. Scott Peck often sees in his therapy room. There are very successful men or women, but their personal lives are a wreck. For example, a person always believes that this world is a dangerous place and no one can be trusted. When digging deep into the past, the doctor discovered this map they drew from the age of 5 to 10 to survive in a family with violent or deceitful parents. At that time, the map, "Don't trust anyone," was completely accurate and helped them survive. But now, when they're 40 years old, have kind colleagues and a loving spouse, they still insist on using that old map to treat people. What are the results? They push everyone away and lock themselves in loneliness. The extremely valuable insight that Scott Peck wants to convey is, our view of reality is like a map for us to manage life. If the map is correct, you will know where you are and where to go. If the map is wrong, you will definitely get lost. The bad thing is that we are not born with a map. We have to draw it ourselves through effort, experience, and even pain. But unfortunately, mapping is extremely labor-intensive. The more effort you put into perceiving reality, the larger and more accurate your map will be. However, the author points out a painful truth. By middle age, most people stop updating maps. They feel that the map they have is more than enough. When reality changes, like children growing up, jobs shifting, or social values changing, instead of bravely redrawing the map, many people choose to destroy the new reality to protect their old map. They become conservative, bitter, and reject all new information simply because it makes them feel insecure. Let's look at everyday reality. Do you see parents still using the "where you put it, there you sit" map of the last century to impose on their Gen Z children who are full of personality? Or there are people who still maintain the belief that hard work is enough, while the world has moved into the era of artificial intelligence and creativity. When reality doesn't go as expected, they start to complain and blame the times instead of admitting that their GPS is broken. True maturity, according to Scott Peck, is not about keeping an unchanging belief, but knowing when to throw it away to build a new one. It requires us to constantly question ourselves, constantly receive unpleasant feedback to modify the map in our heads to match the real terrain of life. Living in the truth can be painful at first because it disrupts peaceful illusions, but in the long run, it is the only foundation for all wise decisions. Calm down and ask yourself, is there a belief or habit I keep holding, even though it only makes me tired, because letting go would mean admitting I was wrong? Redrawing the map is the only way not to stay lost. But human beings do not walk by reason alone. We are also pulled by emotion, especially the emotion we like to call love. From the map of reality, the story moves into a more emotional territory, romantic love. We will enter one of the most controversial chapters, a chapter in which Dr. Scott Peck will shatter our illusions about what society has always praised, romantic love. The trick called falling in love. Why is intense love not love? Have you ever experienced this feeling? You meet someone and boom, the world stops spinning. You can't stop thinking about them. Your heart beats wildly and you firmly believe that this is your life's destiny, the perfect peace that makes you no longer feel lonely. But be careful, because Dr. Peck calls it a biological trick. Let me tell you the story of Lon and Nom, a couple that I believe is very popular. They met and fell madly in love with each other. Lon finds Nam very manly, and Nam sees Lon as the most peaceful place. During the first few months, they seem to be one, never arguing because Lon was willing to give up her hobby of watching movies to play soccer with Nam, and Nam gave up drinking to sit at cafes with Lon. They see themselves as noble and deeply in love. But then, that drunkenness also ended. One day, Nam left his socks haphazardly on the floor, and Lon felt crazy. Lon started wanting to go to the movies with her friends instead of going to the soccer field. Personal boundaries, ego boundaries, that were erased when first falling in love are now suddenly erect again. They begin to see the other person as a separate entity full of flaws, not the hero, in their initial illusion. They concluded, "We're no longer in love," and broke up to find another lightning. According to Dr. Peck, falling in love is not actually true love. He points out two reasons why this is a fatal mistake. First, falling in love is an effortless and instinctive experience, often related to sexual motivation. Second, it is only a temporary collapse of ego boundaries, making us mistakenly think we have merged with others, but in reality we are just falling in love with the perfect image we have drawn for ourselves. So, where is true love? Peck defines it in an extremely dry but poignant way. Love is the will to expand oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another person's spiritual development. The most shocking difference here is, love is not a feeling. Love is an act of will. When you fall in love, you have no choice. The feelings come on their own. But true love is a decision. It requires discipline, effort, and perseverance. Let's look at reality. True love is when you are extremely tired after a day of work, and even though the feeling at that time is that you just want to sleep, you still choose to sit back and listen to your partner's thoughts because you know they need to share in order to grow. Love is when you dare to tell a painful truth to help the other person change, instead of remaining silent to maintain a false appearance of peace. It's not always sweet. It often comes with sacrifice and persistent effort. Many of us are living addicted to the feeling of falling in love. When the initial excitement passes, instead of embarking on the difficult work of learning to love a real person, we choose to give up to find a new feeling of excitement. That's why many marriages fail as soon as the honeymoon phase ends. True love begins the moment the feeling of falling in love disappears. That's when you have to choose. Either continue to selfishly maintain your ego, or accept the effort to expand yourself to join the other person on the path to maturity. Hold on to this question. Are you truly in love with your partner for their growth, or are you attached to the intense feeling they give you because it fills your own loneliness? Distinguishing love from falling in love is a major step toward avoiding tragedy in relationships. But there is another fragile line. How do we know whether we are loving someone or simply becoming dependent on their life? After separating love from the intoxication of falling in love, I want to take you to an even darker land where innocent vows like, "I can't live without you," or "You are my whole world," will be unmasked by Dr. M. Scott Peck. Do you think it's deep love? No. Dr. Peck says it could be a parasitic relationship. Love or parasite. The thin line of dependence. Let me tell you about an extremely common situation that I believe many of you will find tickling. Imagine a girl named Lon. Lon is always proud that she loves her lover with all her heart. She never goes out alone with her friends because she wants to spend every moment with him. Every time he goes on a business trip, Lon feels like her life is collapsing. She can't eat, can't sleep, and can't even decide what to wear today without consulting her lover. Lon calls it sacrifice, great love. But what about reality? Lon's lover began to feel suffocated. He no longer sees the personable girl he once loved, but only sees a tail that always clings to him. Lon doesn't care about whether her lover needs his own space to develop or not. She only cares that he has to be there so she doesn't feel lonely. This is the shocking insight from the book, Love is Not Dependence. Dr. Peck asserts that when one person says they can't live without the other person, that is not true love but a parasitic relationship. In nature, parasites need a host to survive, and in love, the dependent person needs the other person to fill their own fears and emptiness. Dr. Peck explains very simply, true love is an act of will to nurture the development of the other person. Dependence is the opposite. It is aimed at finding security. When you are dependent, you don't want the other person to change. You don't want them to go further or become better, if that makes you feel insecure. Invisibly, you are draining the freedom and development potential of the person you love to serve your own selfish sense of security. Look at real life. This boundary is very fragile. Have you ever seen people who, in the name of love, get sick with jealousy and control their partner's every text and call? They say it's because of love that they keep it, but in reality it's about deep insecurity and a lack of self-esteem. Or parents always try to keep their children with a sense of guilt, making the child not dare to fly away for fear of their parents' sadness. Scott Peck reminds us to be alert. Don't confuse possession with love, and don't use love to chain others. True love, according to Peck, is when two people can live well, independently and happily without each other, but they choose to be together to become better together. It's like two independent circles that partially intersect, rather than two halves of a circle that have to fit together to form a whole. People with true love will always respect their partner's unique identity, even encouraging them to develop unique personalities without fear of being abandoned. When you truly love, you expand yourself and help others grow. On the contrary, when you are dependent, you are shrinking into a tight cocoon of fear. Dependence is the enemy of spiritual maturity because it makes people stand still, fear all challenges, and run away from reality. Be really honest with yourself. Is there anything in your life right now that you are blaming on circumstances to avoid making a decision? Taking responsibility is the first step toward freedom. But to keep that freedom, we need a very practical discipline. Choosing the difficult thing first. From love, we move to a wider question about worldview. We will touch on a topic that may seem a bit sensitive or easily overlooked if you are not religious. It's about religion. But don't change the channel yet, because the religion that Dr. Scott Peck talks about isn't exactly what you're thinking. Do you believe that even if you call yourself an atheist, you are still worshiping something every day? Your own religion. What are you really worshiping? Let me tell you a story about a friend of mine. Let's call him Mr. T. Mr. T always prides himself on being a practical, scientific person and extremely anti-spiritual beliefs. I just believe in what I see and what makes money, he said. However, if you look closely at Mr. T's life, you will see that he has an immutable ritual. Every morning he has to check the stock electronic board first thing in the morning. He worries to the point of insomnia if his account drops, and he evaluates a person's value entirely based on the number of assets they own. Dr. Scott Peck would look at Mr. T and say, that's his religion. In the book, Peck gives a very broad and shocking definition. Religion is your worldview. It is the map of reality we discussed in Part 5, but at the deepest level, it is a belief about the nature of the universe. Is the universe a place of abundance or deprivation? Are humans good or bad? Does this life have any meaning? The most valuable insight in this section is, we all have religion, but most of us are living on a borrowed religion. Peck points out the rather harsh truth that most of our beliefs, from notions of success, money to morality, are things we inherit from our parents or society without ever really questioning. For example, if you grew up in a family where your parents always said, this world is very cruel, don't trust anyone, then that worldview of trust no one is your religion. Even if you go to temple or church every week, if deep inside you always look at everyone with suspicion, then you are actually worshiping vigilance. Or there are people who follow a fundamentalist religion but live in fear because they believe that God is a judge always waiting to punish. Their real religion at that time was fear, not love. The most controversial point that Dr. Peck makes is, to truly mature spiritually, you must have the courage to doubt and even rebuild your own religion. He believes that accepting a belief system just because it's been told so is a sign of spiritual laziness. Maturity is a process where you have to experience yourself, verify reality for yourself, and have the courage to throw away old, outdated maps to draw your own worldview, a worldview based on truth, not on false security. Try looking at everyday reality. Why are there people who work to exhaustion even though they have enough money? Maybe because their religion is recognition, and they worship it by sacrificing their health. Why are there people who never dare to speak out their opinions? Maybe because their religion is false harmony. When you realize what you're really worshiping about, you'll understand why your life is going that way. Dr. Peck reminds us that a stable mind and spiritual growth only come when you have a unique worldview, drawn from discipline and honesty with yourself. It's not something you can borrow or buy anywhere. Before ending this section, I want you to be really honest with yourself. If you strip away all the labels like Buddhist, Christian, or atheist, then what is the real belief that is silently controlling every decision you make today? Daring to question your core beliefs is lonely and difficult, but it is the only way to stop being a copy of the past. And when we begin walking this path of truth, we may notice that life is not only cold discipline. There are also forms of invisible help that Peck calls grace. At a deeper level of maturity, there is something harder to name than discipline or responsibility. Have you ever been in a situation where everything seemed completely stuck? You felt exhausted and wanted to give up, but then suddenly there was some nudge, a chance encounter, a flash of idea, or a strange piece that pulled you up and keep going? Many people call it luck, but Dr. M. Scott Peck calls it by a more formal name, grace. Grace. 1. Miracles from the unconscious. When the universe strengthens you, let me tell you a real situation that perhaps many of us have experienced. Imagine a man who has just gone through the most terrible career crisis of his life. He lost his job, was in debt, and his confidence in himself was completely shattered. He sat in the dark, looking at the tattered map of his life and feeling more alone than ever. But instead of turning to alcohol or avoidance like before, this time he chose to face it. He admitted, "I was wrong, and this is my responsibility." And right in the moment he was most honest with his pain, a miracle happened. An old friend who had not been in contact for 5 years suddenly called just to check in and accidentally introduced a new opportunity. Or simply while walking, he saw a small seedling growing from a crevice in the rock, and some invisible power made him believe that he could do the same. Peck believes this is no coincidence. That's how the universe, or rather the wise unconscious within us, is empowering. 2. Insight from the book. The unconscious mind is much wiser than our conscious mind. This is one of the strange, but also most familiar insights in the book. Dr. Peck affirms that the human unconscious is much more intelligent than the conscious mind. If our consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg, which is full of worries, calculations, and erroneous maps, then the unconscious is the giant sink, which contains the intellectual treasure of all humanity. Peck defines blessing, or grace, as a powerful force beyond conscious control that nurtures our spiritual growth. He points out extremely interesting characteristics of this miracle. It is always nurturing. It helps us grow up and become stronger. It appears often. Miracles don't happen every once in a while. They happen every day. It's just a matter of whether we are alert enough to recognize them or not. Its mechanism is very vague. We cannot use reason to explain why it came at that right time to that right person. But there is an extremely important condition that Peck wants to remind. Miracles only appear when you are brave enough to walk on a difficult path. If you keep taking the easy route, choosing to avoid pain, you will never catch the frequency of blessings. It's like the universe only refuels cars that are actually rolling on a steep road, not cars that are sitting idle in the garage of laziness. 3. Real-life example. When luck is the result of maturity, look at the art of altruism, for example. There are people who are deeply hurt and seem to never be able to forgive the other person. But at a certain moment, they suddenly let go of that burden of resentment. Peck argues that the ability to forgive the seemingly unforgivable is a form of blessing, an invisible force that lifts their spirits beyond the normal instinct of revenge. Or, at work, entrepreneurs often talk about intuitive decisions that later turned out to be vital turning points. That intuition is the voice from the unconscious, the support from a deep belief system that they have painstakingly built through many challenges. When you live honestly and responsibly, your map gradually aligns with reality, and that's when you begin to see blessings appear in every corner of your life. Living consciously enough to recognize the gift of life is one of the highest steps of spiritual maturity. It helps us understand that, no matter how hard the road less traveled becomes, we are never truly walking alone. But that brings us to one final paradox. The person who could write so deeply about wisdom and grace did not necessarily live a life as polished as his words. And here, the story becomes more complicated. The man who wrote about discipline, love, and maturity was not himself a perfect human being. What would you do if you knew that the saint, who taught us how to be disciplined, loving, and mature, had a personal life, broken and full of mistakes? The truth about M. Scott Peck, prophet or sinner. Let me tell you about an event that took place in 2005, just a few months before Dr. M. Scott Peck passed away. A reporter from the Times came to interview him, and the headline of that article shocked the world. Gin, cigarettes, women. I am a prophet, not a saint. Imagine the image of an old man being treated for cancer and Parkinson's, but still holding a glass of gin and a cigarette in his hand. He admitted that he was an addict. He confessed that he had committed adultery many times, and the most heartbreaking thing was that his wife left him, and 2 of his 3 children completely cut off contact and did not bother to talk to their father. A man who wrote beautiful books about spiritual growth and true love failed miserably in connecting with his closest loved ones. Many readers, after learning this truth, felt betrayed and threw the book in the trash because they thought it was a lie. But if we calm down to look at the core inside of the problem, Dr. Peck has unintentionally become a living example of what he wrote. In the book, he asserted, "This life is very difficult to live." And it turns out, for the author himself, it was also so difficult that he repeatedly stumbled on the path he pointed out. There is an unexpected truth that we need to accept. Great messages do not necessarily come from a great person. There are people who are channels for human intelligence. They can see the map very clearly, but their legs are too weak to go all the way. Peck's admission that he was a prophet and not a saint was his final act of respect for the truth, the third tool of discipline he taught us. He does not try to build a perfect image to deceive readers. He exposes his own corruption as a reminder that discipline and maturity are a never-ending battle, and everyone can fail. Look at real life. Have you ever seen a nutritionist who still eats fast food, or a marriage counselor who just got divorced? We often tend to deify teachers. Then when we see that they are too human, we deny even the values they bring. There are opinions that it is because Peck has experienced so many failures, hurts, and self-inflicted loneliness that he is able to deeply understand his patient's pain and write such gut-wrenching words. A person who has never fallen will probably never understand the price of getting up. There are even passages in the book that are extremely controversial, such as when he implies that he can have sex with patients if it really helps them develop, although he later corrects that he has never done so in decades of practice. This shows that Peck is an extremely extreme person in thinking. Sometimes his honesty touches the boundary of danger and illusion. But ultimately, the value of the book lies in the fact that it is a practical toolkit that helps millions of people change their lives, not in the personal ethics of the person who wrote it. The road less traveled is a map, and if that map helps you find your way out of the maze of avoidance and suffering, then whether the mapmaker got lost or not doesn't change the value of those instructions. So the final question is not whether Peck was perfect. The question is, can you still value a diamond if it is found in mud? Will you learn from the painful lessons of a flawed person, or keep searching for a saint who does not exist? The path to spiritual maturity is a lonely, difficult journey full of stumbles. Thank you, Dr. M. Scott Peck, not because you lived a perfect life, but because you were brave enough to show us that path, even when you yourself were struggling to walk it. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. I hope it leaves you not only with a richer view of the book, but also with a clearer view of yourself, what you are avoiding, how you are loving, what you are worshiping, and whether you have enough discipline and love to keep walking your own road.